I'm sitting down with Peter Kenyon, who's the founder and director of the Bank of I.D.E.A.S. Peter, welcome. Thank you for sitting down with me.
Pleasure.
First off, you have recently been awarded the Order of the Medal of Australia, or have I got that around, the Medal of the Order of Australia. You've got a long journey and a long history that led up to that time. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, look, it supposedly was for recognition for our contribution to developing communities across Australia and across the globe. I suppose my origins are in a small town. It's a place called Marble Bar up there in the Pilbara. I have spent my entire life, I think, living in what I call communities, and certainly small rural communities. I'm passionate about community. I'm passionate about the concept of citizenship and people's involvement. And I suppose it's just been a lifelong both dream and mission to contribute and support people who want to build this thing called community. I'm a community enthusiast, and so my journey has been one of looking at how that might happen. I started life as a school teacher. I did an honours degree in history and a DIP-Ed, but unfortunately because I upset the Minister of Education, because I happened to be at that time the President of the Youth Affairs Council of WA, I got posted to a little place called Denmark as far as he could send me, not as the history teacher but as the sports master to an agricultural college. A place called Denmark, right down there on the south coast. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. It really got me into community life. I coached the footy team, I ran a youth club, I discovered this thing called community and how you could wrap community to kind of like do meaningful things, particularly with young people. I then subsequently spent time as a youth education officer in the Ed department, working on school to work and particularly looking at the whole issue of and challenge of this thing called unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment, and looking at innovative ways. But all the time, not how we actually create services or programs, but how do we engage community? How do we wrap community around our young people, particularly when it comes to issues like employment? And so I spent 6 years there. I then went to the university and set up the postgrad diploma in career studies and then the youth work courses in WA. And during that, I got recruited by the state government to design the state's employment strategy. They then said, well, what do you need to make it happen? And I suddenly found myself then heading a Department of Employment and putting that into place. I spent almost a decade heading employment services in WA, but at the end of it, I still came to the conclusion I had never yet seen a community thriving that had been built from the top down or from the outside in. I'm one of those people, it's got to happen from the inside out. It's got to be a self-help job. And I suppose I was able to leave the bureaucracy at a relatively young age, and that was over 30 years ago, and with the support of others go and try to look at how do we build communities from the inside out, from the bottom up, rather than the top down. How do we stop doing things to and for community, and how do we create space of and by the community? And I suppose that's what I've dedicated most of my life to, and we've subsequently had the opportunity of working with about 2,500 communities across Australia and New Zealand and across Southern Africa, across North America, and about 59 countries we've had project involvement with. So it's been an exciting story, it's been a fun story, it's always been done with lots of other people. A lot of it we haven't got a clue what we're doing, but it's been in there kind of like looking at how do we just build this thing called community, how do we wrap community around people, and how do we tackle some of those issues that confront people, and above all, how do we excite community that the answers lie within, not somehow outside.
It sounds like through that history the community found you. You didn't go seeking the community. Can you tell me about some of the highlights, or one of the highlights from your long career?
Well, probably there's been a whole spectrum of highlights. At the top end, when I was heading community employment services in WA, we came up with this whole idea that, young people well, not necessarily just young, but any unemployed person has ideas, they have capacities, they have resources. And many of them had the idea of creating their own enterprise as the way of responding to creating their own job. And so we came up with a program called the New Enterprise Scheme, where we wrapped around people mentors in the community. We had training courses. We put money into a bank, so if people needed to get a bank loan but didn't have collateral, we could actually provide that collateral support. The one thing I couldn't, though, do is give people an allowance to live on. And I had a Churchill scholarship, and I went off and visited 14, 15 other countries looking at community responses to employment. And one place I went to was Ireland, and they had this thing called the Enterprise Allowance, where people could convert their unemployment benefit into an allowance for 12 months. So they didn't need to be work ready, they could just concentrate on their business and getting it up and running, and at the same time receive income equivalent to what was the welfare benefit. I came back and I saw the federal government people who are responsible for that and said, listen, we could do a deal here. We can provide the training, we've got the mentors, we've got the bank loan money. What we don't have is this allowance. Could we create that? And they said, fine, as long as we change the name to the New Enterprise Incentive Scheme called I.D.E.A.S. I need to say that's now the longest running employment program in Australian history. It's been running for 34 years and it's assisted 180,000 unemployed people to start up their business. This year, 7,000 unemployed people will be able to have the opportunity of creating their own job with a living allowance. And I suppose to me, that's just one great memory I've got. And then at the other end, just countless examples of where communities have suddenly discovered assets within the community and have just done amazing things with it.
You mentioned asset-based community there, you mentioned assets. So asset-based community development, is that a new thing?
Well, not necessarily. If you look at the oldest definition of community building that comes from 6th century China, it talks about going to the people, loving the people, starting with what people actually have. And I suppose it's relatively new in the sense that the type of community development that we've known, particularly in this country, since the 1950s, is one where we actually do things to and for people. We always start with what's wrong in the community. We always see the answer to that is to create a program or a service to people. Subsequently, we then refer to people in community as a client or a customer or a consumer of what we're going to do for them. This whole approach, asset-based community development, attempts to flip all that and say, don't start the conversation with what's wrong or what you haven't got or the half-empty bit of the glass. Start with what you have got. Start with your assets. Start with capacity. Start with opportunities. Secondly, realise it needs to be citizen-driven. People need to be a player, not a spectator. People need to be a citizen, a co-owner, a co-designer of what's going on in the community, not a consumer, not a client, not a customer. So it actually flips a lot of what we would and still practice as community development. So it is relatively new. A Catholic priest in the 1920s in Canada is the first person that we knew who really developed it. The language evolved out of the work of two professors in Chicago in the late 90s when they came up with ABCD, asset-based community development. And I suppose since then we've seen, just the diversity of that approach happening now across the globe.
And that leads very nicely into the Power to the People conference, which is about building citizen-driven communities. Can you tell us, why did you start the conference?
Well, the conference actually started almost 20 years ago when a partnership between us and the Municipal Association of Victoria, who discovered that somehow, local government should be on about strengthening communities, not just servicing them, and decided to try to do events that would actually strengthen that perspective of how do we strengthen communities to drive their own development. And that's where it came from. So this is all about citizen driven. This is inside out stuff. This is bottom up, not top down. This is about where people have suddenly said, you know what, we can drive something here and we can take responsibility for our future. This is about where people suddenly said, you know what, let's stop waiting for the cavalry. We are going to do it.
And that's a very strong message that has been throughout the conference, is the power of the individual. Would you say that's a very important part of community development, is that rather than community groups forming services you can just start, you can just do something.
Well, I think so, but not, it is perhaps in some ways even a reaction to what I'd call individualism. This is about saying it is the group effort, it is the community, it is people beginning to say, what is it I care about and who else cares about that in the community, and what is it we together can actually start to do. And I suppose what it's about though is, it's not about, well, we've got this great idea, now who's going to fund it, who's going to come and do it for us. This is about saying, you know what? This is what I care about, this is what you care about. Together, we have these particular motivations and these assets. What is it we could actually do with that? So it actually starts with trying to identify and connect and mobilise our assets, of which our motivations is one of those type of things. But above all, it is about we are in the driving seat. This is citizen-driven, not kind of like service-driven, silo-driven, or even professional-driven. This is about the community starting to kind of like realise they can influence where they're at and where they want to go.
And in this system, how does, or in asset-based community development, what's the role of government?
Look, government, I always say, can play a critical role in helping to facilitate it. I'm not necessarily interested in government funding the stuff. I think it's about trying to create ways of strengthening that whole philosophy and supporting people to do it. And certainly there is a multitude of roles where government can play, but it's not about them doing it for community. It's not about them regulating or controlling the stuff. It's about providing some resources, whether that be training, whether that be helping with facilitating situation, whether that might be with seed funding to get some ideas off the ground or whatever. It's about opening the doors and windows for people to start their own development, as opposed to the traditional role of government to create a program, a service that we then administer to and for people. We've got to move away from that model. It's about opening doors and windows to enable of and by the people.
So you mentioned before that you've engaged in many thousands of successful community projects. What's your latest project?
Look, the latest project is one in my own community. It's a place called Kalamunda. It's in the hills out of Perth. A significant number of senior Australians live in the place, i.e. people who've retired or are planning to retire. And it's an idea called a seniors hub. And it really is about bringing together seniors, and most of seniors up there have one thing in common, and that is they want to live as long as possible, as well as possible, and as inexpensively as possible in their own home, their own street, their own neighbourhood. There's no interest in moving into an aged care facility or retirement place. And so this is a mutual that we're trying to set up. How do we support each other to age well and as long as possible in our own home? And so we're setting up a collective, a mutual, a hub. We're aiming to have 600 or 700 members, and it's primarily about discovering what each person could bring to the mutual. So it's a bit of an asset mapping activity. We're creating a physical space. We're identifying a whole pile of age-friendly businesses that will support older people. It's an idea we pinched out of the States, about over 450 of them there. Here in Australia, there's only 2. We plan to be the 3rd in the country. And that's well under control. So that's the project I'm currently involved in.
Sounds great. We've just wrapped up at the Power to the People conference here in Canberra. What was your biggest takeaway from the conference?
I suppose it's something that I actually just notice at the end of every one of these conferences, and it's just that sudden, again, that realisation what people most enjoy doing is connecting, networking and discovering each other. And again, I just saw the new friendships that have started, the ideas that have been shared, the number of people who comment, you know what I'm going to do? They're going back to leapfrog on an idea that was shared with them. And I suppose it just reinforced in me, that's what we fundamentally need to do. Community building is all about relationship building. And I always hope and dream, and certainly this conference has demonstrated that what people most get out of this is the new relationships and the benefit of those relationships in terms of strengthening what they're trying to do.
Thanks very much, Peter, and we'll see you at next year's conference.
You will do.